Well, guess what? We're in the home stretch. This is the last lecture of the semester. I do plan on scheduling a review session for everyone right before our final exam, which will be open, our final quiz and final exam. Those will be open for several days. You don't have to complete them and wait until the final day, but they will close at the end of the scheduled final period, which I think is on a Thursday of that finals week. So chapter 11 is about allocating costs allocating the cost of hazard risk. So it sounds kind of like an accounting type topic, which it sort of is. Before I get started, let me share my screen with all of you. Okay. So why do we care about how we allocate hazard costs? Well, there's a lot of good reasons we're going to go through. First of all, what type of risk management costs do we allocate? What do we have to allocate across different departments? First thing we need to allocate would be those losses that we're paying for with our own money. So those things that are retained, low dollar, not catastrophic, you decide to retain them, they're within your deductible or your retention. You also have to pay insurance premiums. We have to figure out a logical way to allocate those. Also, if you spend dollars on trying to control costs, maybe minimizing it, you could implement some different measures like safety training. You could implement fire protection systems. Those are all risk control costs. Administrative expenses, things such as salaries for the risk manager like myself, any of the costs we have associated with claims handling. We may have a third-party administrator that helps us with that, but all of those are types of costs. So the best way to disclose this information is what's the true profitability of an organization, and in order to properly allocate costs that we're talking about here, it's really making people accountable for the control and management of those costs. That's basically the summary of this type chapter. What is the purpose of an allocation system? So first of all, you want to clearly identify and attribute those costs to the different departments. So if it has a relationship or a correlation with that department, it should obviously go there. You want to allocate it to those departments that generate the cost. So if one department, for example, City Utilities has a gas, water, electric department, if the electric department is the primary cause of a certain type of loss, like auto accidents, then obviously we want to allocate a larger percentage to them because they're the ones who generated that cost. We also want to promote as much as we can risk control. So if they know that they have to pay for it, they're more likely to take care in reducing it. This is no different than if you hand out something to your children down the road when you guys have kids, and you say, here, if they have no idea how much it takes to earn a dollar and how to manage money, they're not going to have any motivation to control those costs. You also want to figure out a way to facilitate risk retention. So where possible, we'll get into a little bit more detail, when it's possible to retain more risk, you always should do that. You don't have to pay as many insurance premiums. You also want to prioritize your expenditure. You want to reduce costs overall for the organization, and you want to distribute them fairly, which we'll talk about. And then how do we get information, the right information, to managers out there to make the right management decisions? Talk a little bit more about promoting risk control. So allocating costs, like I said, to the responsible department is what you ideally want to do. Each department would be held accountable and rewarded for managing their efforts if you find the right department to allocate it to. However, if you have some kind of cost or expenditure that is really truly attributed to the entire organization, it doesn't make sense to just attribute it to one. So the best example I have is safety measures. We do a lot of safety training for all different areas. We have a safety manager. Those type of costs really help all departments in our organization. However, if we actually put in fire protection controls at the power station, to me, that cost, minimizing that, should be attributed to that department specifically. Talking a little bit more about facilitating risk retention. So if you can accurately predict losses, which is always the challenge, can you accurately predict based on previous data how much loss you're going to incur. If you can predict it the best you can, you're better off trying to figure out what you can retain. So I remember early on in this semester, we talked about figuring out what your right risk retention level is. You know, is it 500,000 retention? Maybe if you set it too high, you end up spending, having to foot the bill for some of the larger losses. However, if you set it too low, you're going to end up turning in claims to your insurance company every time you have a little minor mishap. You know, best example of that is, we all know that insurance premiums for your car, you don't want to turn in every little ding, every dent, little minor scratch on your door. Eventually, every time you turn those in, it's going to make your insurance premiums go up. But you also don't want to set your retention to $5,000 if you can't afford $5,000 and you don't have any savings to pay for that retention or deductible. So that's the best example I can give. You don't want to buy insurance unless you absolutely need it. And where possible, it's highly encouraged to increase your risk retention. It's going to save money in the long run for the organization. And not only do they get to save the premiums, they get to invest it and they get to benefit from the investment returns. How can we get different departments to prioritize spending on risk management? So I have that challenge every day. You know, every department has their pet project. Maybe they want to build a new water treatment area. They want to expand the functionality in a particular area. Maybe they want to do a computer upgrade for one of their control systems. So how do we get them to spend money on risk management expenditures, risk control? If we tell them the importance of how they're going to get money back by cutting their costs or reducing their losses, like maybe they get a reduction in their insurance premiums, you're more likely to get them to agree to spend money there. Now, every year when we do our property review, FM Global is our insurer currently, they give us recommendations to spend on risk management or risk controls. And they say, if you do this, this is going to improve your risk profile. They also give us an estimated cost of doing the recommendation, but they also give us an estimated cost of what it could potentially save us. So the more information you can give departments on how to best prioritize their money to get the most bang for their buck, that's what you want to do. And how you allocate those expenditures to the department has a direct bearing on how they determine where to spend their money. So if you make insurance premiums attributed to them, and you can show that reducing or implementing a new recommendation would actually lower their insurance costs, they're more likely to spend money there because they get a savings in return. Reducing costs is obviously the most important thing. We always want to reduce costs. In order to reduce costs, you need to come up with the most effective way of allocating those costs to the organization, because the closer you can align them with the responsible party and to the people who have the most control over that loss or the expense, they're not going to have any incentive to do anything with it. So the more you promote risk control, losses can be prevented and reduced, which saves money for the entire organization. And also figuring out what that proper risk retention is. How much can you afford to foot the bill for a loss, and how much can you not? So at what level should you buy insurance so you're not financially damaged by that particular loss? If you do a good job of all of these things, you're overall going to reduce your total cost of risk. Fairness is really important. I know it is at my organization. People look at their financials for electric, gas, and water, and they say, here's all these overheads, and some of them say they're related to insurance or risk. If I don't understand what goes into that cost, or I feel like I'm paying more than my share of the expense associated with it, and maybe another department is causing the cost to increase, I'm not going to be happy. There's going to be a lot of objection if there isn't that correlation between their losses and the costs that you're allocating to them. If they can't see that correlation or relationship, they're not going to be happy with what you unfairly distribute to their financial statements. There's a lot less incentive to control costs if they cannot see that correlation. So as we're determining how to come up with the best risk management cost allocation system, so that system meaning what are the best ways to take costs and get them aligned with the right department. There's two primary methods of doing that. You have a risk-bearing system. Make sure you guys know both of these and understand the concept. Risk-bearing versus risk-sharing. So in one extreme, you have risk-bearing, which would be the company or the department. I keep saying company. The department that generates the loss actually gets allocated that cost. They are the ones that bear the risk. So they cause the risk, they get to bear the cost associated with it. That to me is more accountability, better fairness to the departments. However, if there's a catastrophic year here and there, it's going to cause a lot of fluctuations in the financial performance of that particular division or department. The other extreme would be a risk sharing system where instead of trying to align it to the responsible party, you decide to allocate it in some method to each department. It could be based on revenues, it could be based on number of employees, whatever that might be, and you decide to share it in that way. It has no correlation to who actually creates the losses. So obviously it's going to alleviate those individual departmental burdens where they don't get unduly hit by a large loss, and it can stabilize the cost across the department. However, people won't view that as very fair. So to me, the most effective way of doing that is having a balance of the two. You want to do a little bit of both. So some organizations prefer that risk control where the department that creates the loss actually has to pay for it. It definitely rings a bell that they need to control it, and they can control it so that can lower their costs. That's the first priority. However, if you can't do that completely, there's probably some variation or combination of the two type of systems for most companies. So how are we going to provide that cost information to our managers and decision makers? Accurately allocating the cost actually forces them to focus on the areas where the cost can be reduced, being very involved in how they can control the costs that they actually can make a difference on. You don't want to make that system too complex, hard to understand. You definitely want to make sure that your incentives are clearly outlined. I'll give you a couple examples here in a minute. For we track auto, fender benders. We are self-insured. So if someone accidentally backs in their car and hits something and it could have been preventable, we make sure and report that if you can keep those type of preventable accidents down, you'll get a financial reward. Or if they don't see the correlation between what you're sharing with them and how the cost will impact them, it's too complex for them to follow. They're not going to understand it and not follow, not support it. Any information you have on past claims, any loss exposure reports, maybe you're seeing an upward trend in certain types of losses in your division or industry. All of those things are going to be helpful in determining what information do you want people to have to make better decisions. And also having a system that can be independently validated and keeps it from being manipulated by one department is better than the alternatives. So it's really, more surprisingly than you might think, different. There's a lot of incentive to manipulate costs. Obviously, they want the best bottom line. If they can hide costs or manipulate and put them in areas where you're not going to easily find them, they have an opportunity to manipulate how their financials will look, which we don't want to happen. So the manipulation can happen internally. So, this happens all the time at CU. They hide the fact that they've had claims. Why do they do that? Because they don't want people to know that they screwed up. If they made a mistake and they have waste, or one of their employees made a mistake and damaged something, they obviously don't want to share that. So that happens all the time, more than you'd realize, that people will suppress or not report all their claims. They'll just cover it up. Another thing they can do is they could actually manipulate the amount of reserves that they need to have set aside. And remember, loss reserves would be cash on hand sitting aside to cover potential losses coming up. There's also potential for external manipulation of costs, where either stockholders, organizational owners, or senior managers have an incentive to maybe their compensation is based on the financial well-being of the organization, if they perform well, whatever their earnings were for the quarter. So if there's any kind of correlation between they have a reason to manipulate the bottom line, you need to be really cautious about how costs are managed from a risk management side of things. So when they don't like what the financial objectives that they've set out, they have certain earnings targets that they haven't met, then they're more likely to cover up where that's gone. And also can have an impact on what the ultimate price that they charge is going to be for their product or service. So you want a governance board that can oversee it. That would definitely help prevent some manipulation if there's an independent review. There are 4 types of risk hazard risk management costs that we need to allocate. We talked about insurance premiums. We talked about the cost of managing or controlling risks like safety programs or fire prevention. Those are all risk control techniques. We also have the cost of administering risk management activities, so salaries and claims handling, investigation expenses, those would all fall there. And then finally, we have the cost of those losses that we don't have insurance for. So these are out-of-pocket losses that were accidental, or they were actually were caused by an outside entity. Now that can happen too. You have a vehicle, someone hits you, you don't know who hit you, you incurred damage, and so you don't have insurance, maybe potentially for that unknown, uninsured motorist, as an example. So you want to design a system that helps you figure out how to allocate these costs. And you don't have to have a one system to meet all of these exposures. For example, it may make sense that insurance premiums are allocated with one method, but when we get down to cost of risk control techniques, those are easier aligned with the department or subsidiary that actually implemented them. So maybe premiums is based on a prorated revenues amount, where risk control can actually be tied to the specific department that spent the money on it. Salaries and claims handling, a lot of times it's hard to allocate fairly, but it's something we could look at as an organization. So there's also 2 different ways to look at cost allocation, the prospective approach and the retrospective approach. And if you guys don't remember, we did talk about retrospective plans where after the end of the period, if you've done a really good job of managing your costs, you could actually get the potential premiums paid back to you. So again, we hope that we pick a system that works best for our organization. And a prospective process, they have to figure out the approach, and sometimes it's best to balance them. Both systems seek to balance between loss experience, which is history, versus loss exposure, what's my potential probable loss. Both of them try to do that. So from a prospective approach, you're estimating things at the beginning of the period based on what you know. This happens all the time with insurance. They give you an estimated premium, they tell you what it's going to be, and no matter what, that's the premium you're going to pay. If you end up having more or less losses, they're not going to give you a refund, and they're definitely not going to charge you more. So it's a flat amount, and you're never going to adjust that. So the costs are never changed period to period, regardless of what your actual experience is. Retrospective, if you recall, is where we estimate at the beginning of this period. Work comp's a great example. They give you a premium based on estimated payroll. You don't know what your total payroll is going to be for the year until the end of the year. So you come back and you look at it. Or maybe they charge you more based on the number of losses or claims that you had during the year. So with a retrospective, the costs that were incurred could actually be reallocated or refunded depending on how it came out on actual experience. And with the prospective, costs are usually allocated primarily on the basis of potential exposure and secondarily on loss experience. The reason is they look at what the probability or the potential exposure is, so that way they get the most monies or costs allocated to you. With retrospective, their primary focus would be on allocating actual experience, because they can go back and charge you if things are better or worse. And their secondary focus would be on what's the potential exposure. A little bit more focus on actuals retrospective. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of each? From a perspective, obviously that helps keep your budget stable. You know what you're going to have to spend. If they quote you a price that you're going to have to spend, and you know what the salary is going to be fixed for the entire year, you don't have to worry about whether it's going to go up or down, because you don't have to pay any more and you won't get any more back. The disadvantage, that's the only primary advantage. Make sure you guys look at these advantages and disadvantages. A lot of disadvantages. First of all, what you actually incur for losses can substantially differ from what you thought it was going to be, and you have to correct those in a prior period or a subsequent period. So this happens all the time. You know, if you get an auto premium from your insurance carrier and they know you're a good driver, but then all of a sudden you have a bunch of losses, that's going to have an impact in following years when they go back and look at how much money it costs them to insure you. There's no way for corrected costs to be fixed, because you don't have the ability to adjust that. So some of those costs have to be absorbed. And then any increase or decrease in risk control activities that you decide to implement would actually have a lot of delay. There's no correlation or less correlation between what you're doing and getting a payback or being able to observe a payback. The more you can correlate it with what you're doing today, the more likely it's going to sink in with them that they're doing something that actually is helping save them money. Now, talking about retrospective, there's a few more advantages for that. First of all, you get costs that are more closely aligned with the department, and they're better attributed. They're fairer to everyone. But if you actually spend money on risk control, you actually see some refunds or benefits associated with what you've done. So, you know, that correlation makes sense to them. The disadvantages is you're going to have a lot of variability in your budget. It's hard to budget for things like that because you don't know if it's going to be higher or lower, and you can't determine sometimes what those overall costs are until after the end of the period. So it actually can impact future periods of earnings. So we've talked about this in other classes, and when we allocate costs, what is the basis for which we're going to allocate costs? You can either allocate based on your total exposure, or you could do it based on loss experience. So to give you an example, property, they're going to estimate that on your potential exposure, and they a lot of times do that based on square footage, or they do it based on your insurable values of the property you're insuring. That has nothing to do with whether you've had a lot of losses in the past, or you've either done a really good job or you're not. So you really have two different ways of looking at it. What's my potential exposure and versus what is my actual experience and what has it been? An exposure-based system allocates costs regardless of what your loss experience is. So it's going to say, because you have a lot of property value, I'm going to have to charge you more because you have that potential exposure. And the charges to the departments don't change as long as the loss exposures don't change. Now, that can happen in a year and quickly. You may have, decades with no losses, and all of a sudden you have some. So it's hard to predict. An experience-based system, you're trying to allocate costs according to that prorated amount that's happened in the past. And basically, the only problem with that would also be that you subject the smaller departments to significant fluctuations in costs from period to period. So sometimes that's hard to budget and manage. When we're allocating hazard costs, again, you want to probably look at a blended allocation. You're using some combination of the loss exposure as well as the experience. And this happens all the time. An insurance company is going to look and see what your total cost or values are that you're trying to insure. They're going to look at how much payroll you have, number of employees. But then they're also going to look at your history. If you have a great history and you haven't had a lot of losses, that's going to help give you a discount. So there has to be that blended approach to underwriting and charges. The loss exposure types that generate frequent claims rely more on loss experience rather than exposure. So, if you have a lot of claims, it's going to look at what happened in the past, and they're going to tie more to historical experience. Those companies or departments that are better able to generate their costs, they have more financial resources. They're going to want their costs allocated based on experience rather than loss exposure. So they know, I can take those hits when it hits me 1 year, I have a big loss, and then I could go 10 years without. It's not going to cripple them. But again, there's lots of different ways to look at it, and a lot of different companies like to allocate it in different layers, which is a complex thing we're not going to talk about in this particular chapter or this semester. A little bit more on exposure basis. We've covered this in 313, I know, but how do we allocate costs? It could be that you determine what your premiums are based on your revenue. It could be based on the number of employees you have. It could be based on the square footage of the property you're insuring. It could be the nature of your operation. Maybe you're building explosives. That's going to be a lot more exposure than if you are selling something in a retail space where there's no danger of high explosion probability. It's also going to look at your territory. So obviously you could potentially pay more depending on where you're located. Some areas of the United States, maybe if you're in a high-risk hurricane or wildfire area, you're going to have to pay more. And then they also try to allocate a rate per unit of exposure. We've done this in previous chapters where we've done calculations. So let's say I have property insurance again, and I'm going to pay so much rate. Let's say it's 4 cents per $1,000 of insurable value. So that's what we mean by a rate per unit of exposure. And that unit of exposure could be per $1,000 of insured value, could be per $1,000 of revenue. It could be based on a certain percentage of your square footage. Geographic location, again, can help determine and estimate your losses. That really does play a lot into your overall cost. So looking at the different policies, there's four of them listed for sure. General liability, there's a lot of common ways to allocate, but the most common ways that they use to allocate for general liability is either revenue. It could be based on square footage of floor space, could be based on a budget, it could be on number of sales or number of full-time employees. Auto is one that really it could be dependent on the type of vehicles you have. Maybe you have the heavy-duty work trucks versus the smaller autos, or it could be based on number of miles driven. That's a real common base. Work comp is typically based on payroll, or it could be based on number of people or head count. And property is really commonly tied most likely to square footage or property value. I know ours is based on property value, so it looks at what is the worth of the property if I need to replace it, and then you pay some portion of that. A few other exposures like crime, those are really hard, but they could be proportionately applied based on the type of overall cash that you have on hand. Loss experience. So if we're looking at loss experience versus, we know that based on historical claims that we've paid out, this is a good way to project future costs. Really, it depends on how good is the data that you have. If it's reliable, if it's consistent, you're more likely to be able to better project future losses. But again, you have to have good data. If you don't have a lot of data and it's not very reliable or consistent, then it's not going to do you any good. It also could look at what your projected ultimate incurred losses are, or it could look at how much you have in reserve versus payment. So, there's different ways of looking at loss experience. Helps determine the best way if you have good predictable data. It also could look at, how much exposure or limit do you want to put out there. And I don't know if you guys remember, in it was either the second or third chapter, we tried to set a threshold. We're not going to look at anything that's above 50,000. We're not going to look at anything above 100,000. And by doing that per occurrence limit, you actually take out the outliers and trying to figure out what you want to focus on limiting. Those catastrophic type losses are things you know you're going to insure, and you probably want to look closer at the things that are more controllable and manageable, that you actually would get payback on. For prospective plans, losses are usually allocated over the experience period. So, they look or collected over an experience period. If you know that you're not going to be able to adjust the premium, the insurance company is going to want to look at the last 2 to 5 years. What do you typically have in terms of losses? And they're going to try to predict what they're going to charge you. They want to get as close as they can to accurate. And a lot of times that is based on experience. If you don't have a lot of experience or data, historical data, then that's going to be really hard to project. So they'll have to come up with another method of doing that. And so last slide is just as you're coming up with a cost allocation system and I know this doesn't sound very important from an insurance perspective, but having been a risk manager for many years, how you allocate costs, how you educate your employees on how they can help you control costs, because they don't view it as their cost. They view it as that's somebody else's concern, not mine. You really want to look at ways of making that correlation hit home with them so that they can help you control costs. One of the things you need to look at is, can your accounting system manage the cost? Can it capture the cost in a way that would make it easier for you to allocate in a certain method? You also want to look at what's the tax incentive or tax advantage of setting it up a certain way, if there is one. Maybe at minimum you want to charge every department. Maybe one department has a lot heavier burden on the control of the losses, but you want to give everybody a certain minimum charge to help pay for the baseline expenses for a risk management department. You also want to look at materiality. If something's insignificant, not very material, you don't want to spend a lot of time, splitting hairs on figuring out how to allocate it. So don't make it too complex. You also want to reward and penalize people so that they better understand, they're actually going to be impacted negatively if they don't do their job, and they're going to be rewarded for doing something that they can control. So you want to build in those penalties and rewards. This one, I can't express enough how important it is. You as a risk manager or the accounting department can come up with any numerous ways of allocating costs. But if your frontline managers don't understand how they impact the bottom line and how the allocation works, you're never going to get buy-in. And if they don't understand why and how, they just look at it as some arbitrary cost that they can't control. So you want to include them in those discussions. Having consistency in your system is so important, and then also having a decentralized risk management system, because if you have an opportunity to manipulate the data, there could be some ethical concerns there. And we had this in a previous exam, but you guys, I think this is our last one, is Risk Management Information System, RMIS. That's the type of system where you would actually, implement this software-based system that helps you apply the experience-based allocation system. And the reason I say that is it's going to collect past loss experience, and it's going to help you try to predict and better estimate where your losses are going to be in the future. That's all I have for Chapter 11. I'm going to be scheduling a review session sometime early next week. You will have the quiz posted again sometime early next week. Then you'll have some days to get that done. And then your final exam will be due by 2 p.m. on the date of our exam, which I think is scheduled from maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's 11 to 1, I can't remember, but you'll have to look it up. Whenever the closing time is for the exam final, that would be when we're going to close it. So I hope you have a great weekend, enjoy the weather, and hang in there, we're almost done. Talk to y'all soon.